Good morning. Time now a few minutes after 8 o'clock in the morning in Tokyo, Tuesday, April 12th, 2022. Welcome to another edition of the World Bank online seminar organized by its Tokyo office. My name is Koichi Omori. I am Senior External Affairs Officer of the World Bank based in Tokyo. We organize those online seminars in order to introduce the latest report in timely manner to the stakeholders in Japan, having the World Bank economists and specialists as our speakers. Every spring and fall, each of 6 regional chief economist offices publishes the regional economic update to capture the regional economic trend and key topics with depth analysis. For the spring 2022 series of regional economic update, we'll try to capture all of those reports in the morning seminar. And we are kicking off our journey today with East Asia and the Pacific region as usual. We have Aegis Islamaj, Senior Economist in the Office of Chief Economist for East Asia and the Pacific region, connecting with us from Washington. Good evening, good morning to you, Aegis. How are you? Thanks for joining.
Hi, Koichi. Thank you for the nice introduction.
Great, thank you very much. We'll listen to Aegis for the next 30-40 minutes, presenting the main findings of the latest edition of the East Asia and the Pacific Economic Update, titled Braving the Storms, released on April 4th. Following his presentation, I'll read your question. If you did not have opportunities to send your question in advance, please do so using online form posted on the announcement page for the seminar, or you can simply post your question on the chat section of the YouTube screen. I'll read your question after the keynote presentation by Aegis, asking him to respond. With that, I would like to ask Aegis to come in to start your presentation formally. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Koichi, and thank you to your audience. Every time after our updates, this is our first presentation outside our official launch and our official World Bank dissemination seminar, and it's very fitting that as one of the biggest stakeholders for the World Bank, we actually present and it's in some sense brief to the Japanese stakeholders about what's going on in the developing region. So now again, this update is about the developing region, just because as the World Bank we focus on developing countries. It doesn't necessarily focus on Japan, but hopefully there's a lot of things that you're going to learn today that's going to be useful to your audience as well. Just to go through the agenda, I will try to only give the punchlines, and hopefully that can entice a nice policy discussion, or at least nice questions, because I cannot see your faces. But I want to talk briefly about the recent developments. And this part, this section, the recent developments, unfortunately, it will sound a little bit all doom and gloom with everything that's going on. And we believe that that these recent developments in the global arena are very serious, and there are repercussions being felt in the developing region. But then after talking about those and what we can expect, as I'm going to show, basically we can discuss that there are also some opportunities for this region. And this region has actually been good in the past at taking advantage of opportunities and making sure that they show resilience during these hard times. But again, despite these opportunities, there's a lot of issues, because now we have some global shocks on top of one of the biggest shocks that we saw in the last decade, which was COVID. So I'm going to finish by discussing what policymakers can do. And there are some limitations this time. It's not about strategies and coming up with the right policies, but there's also limitations in terms of fiscal and monetary space. So we're going to present what are our views on those, and I'll be looking forward to your questions and comments. So to get started, so again, now we are back to recent developments. There was a dip in GDP growth in the region around the third quarter of 2021, for some countries maybe a little earlier. And this is what we referred to in the last update as the Delta dip. So this was basically caused because there was an increase in infections due to the Delta variant. And we started being cautious. Private consumption was suffering. A lot of institutions and also investment banks were lowering their projections, their forecast for the region. But then somehow miraculously, after this short-lived Delta dip, the region actually started resume recovery at a fast pace in the fourth quarter of 2021. This recovery was led by China, but also we saw an acceleration in the rest of the region. Needless to say that this recovery, which was basically picking up on the region recovering from the Delta shock that hit the region and the rest of the world in the beginning of 2020, has been uneven across countries. In some countries, GDP level is already above pre-pandemic levels. And we spoke in the last updates about China and Vietnam, etc. And now Indonesia has also gotten there, and Malaysia is very close to the line. But in some other countries, at the end of 2021, like for example in Thailand, in the Philippines, and in many Pacific Island countries, GDP remains still well below pre-pandemic levels. So this graph shows the level relative to pre-pandemic. So on top of this picture, where we have a region recovering, but still a lot of unevenness across the region, three international developments are shaping the external conditions. The first and the most serious one is the war in Ukraine. As we've seen and heard a lot, from the news, and we've seen the prices in many countries going up. The war is causing disruptions in food and fuel. It's increasing financial volatility around the world, and is decreasing the confidence of investors and maybe even consumers in some countries as they are thinking ahead of what these shocks might mean. So this was the first shock. This shock, or it's actually, so it's when I say shock, it's basically something that is happening right now. It's not just a risk, just to make sure that this is how we think of it, and there's a distinction. This comes on top of two other developments. One is basically a decline in China, which is expected. And this is due, first, there was a structural slowdown in China going on, like if a few years back, even 5-6 years back, China's GDP growth was, there's a digit number, but in the upper digit number, it was 7, 8, and before that it was double digits. Lately, it's been approaching to 6, 5, and so on. So we expect that to continue, and this is normal as China transitions to a consumer-based model. At the same time, we saw in the second half of 2021, we saw some financial stress in China, which was led by some controls that the government put on an over-leveraged real estate sector. So that exposed basically some issues. We had this sector that has been growing a lot. At some point, it was making up, by some estimates, is about 1/3 of so the debt there was about 1/3 of GDP in China. And then once the government started putting these red rules, than we saw in investors going out of there. We're not sure what's going to happen to these investments in real estate sector in China going forward. Is it going to continue at the same pace? The government is making efforts, but it's reasonable to expect a slowdown, especially since a lot of this was done as an so basically the demand for the real estate in China was driven a lot by the need to invest the money in these assets that had this growing value rather than the need for housing per se. And the third, so the last but not least shock for China is this continuing COVID-19 shock. So basically the increase in infections due to the Omicron wave now, and this happens amidst a zero COVID policy in China, and that's going to hurt demand. So this is something that basically is a little, this shock at least is sharper than expected earlier in the year, because we thought that Omicron will be kind of benign for the region, but if we think that China is sticking to its zero COVID policy, then even though the death due to Omicron remains low, basically the effects on the economy will be felt through restrictions in demand. The last shock that we consider and we think that may affect the region is basically what will happen in the United States. So the first bullet talks about the cyclical slowdown. So this is not to say that there's going to be a recession in the U.S. or slow growth in the U.S. It's just saying that U.S. in the recovery from the COVID-19 recession, there was a lot of demand fueled by the money that was given to consumers by the government. So the growth in 2021 was probably higher than we see in a typical year in the US, and that growth coming down will just mean less growth, maybe less demand for the region. At the same time, the increasing inflation in the United States is leading to financial tightening. A lot of this financial tightening, we believe it's already expected, and the projections that our country economists have put forward take that into account, and emerging markets are somewhat prepared that the US is tightening, but if this tightening happens to be faster than anticipated, then we analyze, according to some of our estimates, that this will lead to real negative effects. So basically, GDP growth in the emerging countries in the region will be affected negatively. So these three shocks will affect the region through trade and through financial channels. This is something we show in the report and then we discuss at length. Now, here I'm just going to give a brief presentation about each of the channels, how it is affecting the region. So the first one is about the first channel is coming from the war in Ukraine, and it's going to affect the region through fuel and food price spikes, and will hurt especially those that are dependent on commodity imports, right? So here what we did, we basically just presented a picture of the net exports of different commodities in the region, and we see that there's a lot of variation in the region. Some countries, I'm going to talk about Mongolia later, but like Malaysia and Indonesia, they are net exporters of energy, and in that sense they might see a little bit of improvement from maybe in their fiscal situation or in their current account balance as the prices of these commodities go up. But many other countries, including Philippines, Thailand, Cambodia, and almost all of the Pacific Island countries are net commodity importers. And as the prices of these commodities go up, the cost of production for these countries will go up. But at the same time, we know that a lot of prices of some food-related items are also going up, and especially the price of wheat, corn, and fertilizers. Now, Russia and Ukraine, they export wheat mostly, and corn, and some fertilizers and some metals. But the region consumes rice. But we also believe that the price of rice will go up because rice and wheat are basically substitutes. And if people switch from wheat to rice, then we'll see an increase in the price of rice. And many countries which import rice on top of corn and wheat will see basically an increase in the cost of food imports, which will directly hurt their consumers. Even for the countries that export some of these commodities, like Vietnam and Cambodia are exporting rice, because the war in Ukraine is affecting the supply and the price of fertilizers. Again, their costs will go up on top of the added cost of energy that some of these countries are already importing. So by looking at commodities, even though here and there you can pick some countries are exporting, and maybe yes, certain segments will be better off, but overall the picture is not good because almost the prices of all goods will go up, including of food, which will directly affect consumers. The second channel is basically, as I said, is slowdown in China. Now, and this will come on top of, basically will affect global demand as well, especially as GDP declines also in the United States and Europe due to the war in Ukraine. Now, the East Asia and Pacific developing economies are actually very exposed to the rest of the world. We know that they are open to trade and finance. What this chart shows is basically the value-added exports that are destined for ultimate consumption in the rest of the world. Now, notice this is value-added, so this is basically what these countries bring to the value of those exports. It's not just total exports. Sometimes we know, these countries might import, let's say, 90% of iPhone from Singapore or Malaysia, and then add something to that and export that, and that goes in the value of total exports. But in this case, this what we're seeing here translates directly into the production of these countries, which means their GDP. So as the global demand declines, so will the external demand for these countries affecting their growth. The third channel is the financial channel. So as the financial volatility around the world, so as financial markets tighten around the world, and this can be as a result of the war, but also as a result of what I described earlier, financial tightening in the US and other major economies as they deal with inflation, then the most affected countries will be those with large current account deficits and also large external debt, especially short-term debt. This includes countries like Cambodia, maybe Laos, Solomon Islands, but also Mongolia and Lao PDR in terms of having external debt. But also Malaysia and Thailand are countries that have high short-term debt. So in those cases, so far things are fine in these larger economies. But if this shock gets worse, if the financial tightening continues for worse, then things might get more complicated. So what we do next in our update, we try to look at to use different empirical and modeling approach to get a sense of how big these shocks that are happening, how much are they going to affect GDP growth in East Asia and Pacific economies. Now, I want to emphasize that the purpose of this exercise was not to get precise estimates about what the growth effect would be of, for example, in the screen you see like a monetary shock in the US. But the idea was to get a sense of what direction, kind of can guess that they are all negative, but what is the direction of these shocks on the economies of the region, and basically, get a sense of their statistical significance and of their relative importance. So if any shock is more important than the other. So now, as I'm going to go through this, basically you can agree or disagree with me, but this comes from data and from well-established empirical approaches. A monetary shock in the United States, which basically means a faster than expected tightening in US interest rates, will negatively affect GDP growth in the region. So notice, we're not talking about financial spillovers. We're talking about financial spillovers in the US or in major economies with real effects, basically real GDP growth slowdown in the region. A slowdown in China, and here in China we did two types of exercises. One is where we only modeled a decline in real estate investment, and another one where we did a decline in demand, which could match basically the zero COVID policy, or what are the effects of the zero COVID policy as COVID infections rise. In both cases, we tried to calibrate them using a real world scenario. So basically for real estate sector, just looking at what happened last year, and for the COVID-19 shock, basically what happened during the Delta wave when China again had like a zero COVID policy. And again, these effects are significant for the region. They will lead to a slowdown in GDP growth, and these effects are within a year. When it comes to the effects of the war in Ukraine, now here we split the sample between commodity exporters and commodity importers. And as I said before, the commodity importers, as expected, are going to suffer, are going to see a decline in their incomes, whereas the exporters of energy and food, are likely to see like a small increase in their income. This is all model-based. But, as these shocks compound and affect, financial tightening in the rest of the world, all countries will be negatively affected by the financial shock. And on top of that, basically we see that as these effects of war in Ukraine are affecting financial markets, it's becoming global. And if you look, for example, OECD estimated a few weeks ago that global growth will be at least 1 percentage point lower due to the war in Ukraine, then this global growth slowdown has been shown many times from work in the World Bank, a negative and statistically significant effect on the GDP growth in the countries in the region. Again, this is like basically growth slowdown compared to what it would have been without the shock. So hence, putting this picture together, we downgrade growth projections for 2022 compared to our last update. So in our previous forecast, the region was estimated to grow at around 5.4% for 2022. But now, as we add up all the shocks that I told you about, and in some cases, we also, well, not the same, but in all the time we took into account country-specific circumstances, and basically, in some cases, these country-specific circumstances were actually good. For example, in the Philippines, at the beginning of the year, until the beginning of the year, we had predicted, that as Omicron was coming, then Philippines will again be affected, and demand will be really low due to COVID. But once Omicron and turned out to be more benign than expected, then what we saw is that these countries, Philippines, Thailand, Indonesia, they actually started relaxing their restrictions, and we expect that this will basically lead to higher than demand that we previously anticipated. So these are positive factors, but again, adding all the shocks that I told about, the net effect is going to be negative. In addition to that, because we don't know the outcome of the war, under a scenario where basically the effects of the war in Ukraine for the world economy are larger, which means that they go for longer, the commodity prices remain high for the rest of the year, and financial markets continue with volatility for some time, then these negative effects on the growth of the region would be even larger, and we estimate a low case scenario where GDP for the region can be as low as 4%. So to recap, earlier we had forecasted 5.4% for the region growth, GDP growth for the region in year 2022. We revised it down to 5% due to the war and all these other shocks, but we also envisage a low case scenario where things get really worse, and then that growth for the region will be 4%. Again, this for countries like Malaysia and Indonesia, you can see there that, the downgrades are probably like small because, as I said, they are commodity exporters, and that will help basically accommodate some of the shock. But for other countries, like for example, island countries, and also for Mongolia, these effects can be large. Now, for island countries, the story there is that first, they are all, as you saw, commodity and food importers, and are likely to be affected quite a bit by this by the effects of the war. Second, the island countries were just about to open their economies and hoping that they'll restart the tourism. But what we saw is that now COVID basically got to many of these countries for the first time since COVID started, like in a serious way. And okay, it's the Omicron wave, so it is not maybe as lethal as Delta, but at the same time, the immunity in these countries and previous exposure to the disease is very low, so we don't know how it's going to affect them. And it's definitely affecting demand now. And thirdly, several of these islands were affected by natural disasters, and that's also is adding to their problems. For Mongolia, now Mongolia exports coal, so when you look at this picture of exports and imports, it might look like, oh, Mongolia is probably going to be doing well. But again, some specific circumstances are affecting Mongolia. So first, yes, Mongolia is exporting coal, but those exports are going to be affected due to some border closures with China that are related to China's zero COVID policy, and basically they have been going on for longer than initially everybody was hoping for, and we expect them to go on until the end of 2022. At the same time, Mongolia is dependent on Russia to import fuel, and also many of the imports of Mongolia's imports on other goods, for example, imports that come from Europe, have to go through Russia. So Mongolia is dependent on Russia, as a modem for its imports, in addition to importing directly. So basically, these delays and these problems and these increasing prices that basically originated from Russia will affect Mongolia as well. Now, as I said earlier, we want to basically also talk about opportunities that this region have, and I'm noticing that I need to move a little faster, so I'll do that right now. So now the first opportunity comes in the way that the way these countries have positioned themselves in the global value chain environment. Now, we had talked before in the past updates that these countries have been very, very innovative, and basically they were, when COVID hit, they turned out to be, most of these countries turned out to be producing the goods that were in high demand, mainly like electronic goods, and that's why they saw their exports boom during COVID. But there's also in other ways that these countries were improving their situation. Like what was happening, and we see that real wages are increasing in China, and then in addition to that, here and there have been like issues like, for example, the trade tension in the United States, and then the COVID that made many countries rethink their dependence on these global value chains. And as a result, we see that over time, for example, starting in 2018, the share of US imports, final goods imports from China, has been decreasing, and it seems to be in a declining trend. At the same time, the share of other EAP countries, developing EAP countries imports, the US share of those imports has been increasing. So basically, as there's been an aversion to dependence from China, at least from the US, it seems like these global value chains are shifting from China to other countries in the region, and this is actually good news, and this is the best evidence that we could find to document that. But at the same time, as these countries and the rest of the world still depends on a lot of intermediate goods from China, then we see that the share in EAP intermediate good imports so China's share in EAP intermediate goods imports has been increasing. So basically, these countries are exporting more to the US, and they are also trading more with China to basically produce those goods. So this is the good news. Not all countries are benefiting equally from these trends. For example, Vietnam and some extent Malaysia and Cambodia are actually have been increasing their share in US final goods imports, whether other countries like Thailand, Philippines, Indonesia are not so much. We also look into the report, what can explain some of these things, and basically try to understand a little bit, what countries can do better. Another thing, and this is something we also have talked before, so I'm going to move fast, is that COVID has accelerated the technology adoption, and so this reflects what has been happening in emerging markets, basically, and also in the AP countries. And these improvements in technology are not limited to just online sales, which is e-commerce, but also to more, say, data analytics, more processes of the operations of the firm, which also help increase their productivity. So now, again, I'm going to go fast here. Needless to say that these shocks are coming on top of what was another major shock, which was COVID, which saw shrinking sales and employment losses across the AP. So these charts are drawn from these business pulse surveys that the World Bank has conducted during COVID, basically showing how hard this COVID shock was for households and for firms. And even in countries like Indonesia, for example, that have tried to do better now and generally have a more positive attitude, the real earnings, the income of households is lower than it was pre-COVID. And at the same time, what happened during COVID basically increased food insecurity and also the wealth of households, and especially so for the poorest one. So on top of all this, and if you calculate all the response that the governments gave in the region, which was unprecedented in many ways, now comes another shock that is going to increase the cost of living for many households and the cost of production, lowering the profit margins for many firms. So what can be done? Now, these countries used fiscal policy successfully in the past to prop up demand. Now the things are a little more tricky because we see that the fiscal space has been shrinking. Like general government debt increased a lot, at least by 10 percentage point, during the COVID times on average across countries. And for some countries, like if you look at the Philippines or countries like Fiji, which also had natural disasters, it increased by, much more than that, 20 and 30% respectively. But at the same time, both private and public investment has been decreasing in the region. So is the fiscal space going to be enough to basically revive public investment? There's still some fiscal space left, but not as much as before. So this is a note of caution. Now, some things can be done. Again, where possible, we basically recommend that the governments use them as effectively as possible. But one thing that governments can do is basically use the ammunition that they have more efficiently. So in the past, we saw that government assistance has not been selective. For example, the chart that you see here on the left is basically shown that during COVID, households that did not need assistance were as likely to receive government assistance as the households that actually needed assistance. So this suggests that government assistance was not used as efficiently during COVID. This is some simulations that we've done when using it more efficiently. So rather than having a universal basic income policy, so where you basically give money to everyone to reduce poverty, and you are able to reduce some poverty. If you are more selective, and so let's say you go to the most extreme, and you use this proxy means testing, so you basically target better who needs the money and who you give it to, then you would reduce the poverty rate by as much as 2 percentage points more than you can do with, say, universal basic income. So first recommendation, try to make the spending more efficient. Of course, we have other recommendations in the report, especially, try to make reforms, for example, like Indonesia is doing to increase revenues, commit to reforms in the future, with the fiscal rules to show that you are committed to disciplines, so on. Monetary policy, there's some monetary space in the region. I'm going to tell you why, but again, it's a little tricky because monetary policy needs to strike a really fine balance now between external pressures and domestic needs. Now, we saw that, there's all these pressures. So as US interest rates are increasing, everybody thinks taper tantrum and what can happen. Now, the good news is that the real interest rate differential with the US and many countries in the region is still high. So we're hoping that, with good policies and basically showing that, these countries are serious about having their finances in order, then we hope that there won't be like a risk of capital flight. So there'll still be some room for these countries to keep the interest rates low. And at the same time, now they should be worried because inflation is approaching target, or it's basically going on the upper side of the target in many of these countries. But again, the good news is the core CPI, which matters more for policy, is still lower contained in many countries. So this basically on the monetary policy side, the situation allows them to continue supporting their economies, but they should be careful because this is a different kind of shock, and make sure not to prop up inflation too much, and then watch out for capital flight. At the same time, again, we have said this in several ways. We're just showing some more evidence in this update, is that all the extra effort that the policy together with the financial sector did to support their economies during COVID has led, we believe, to increased risks. Some of those are hidden and we cannot see them, due to basically the forbearance that many countries applied. Some indicators that we are seeing, for example, the solvency and liquidity measures, for example, are showing that these countries are actually, you cannot say, because they are subjective, you cannot say good or bad, but compared to other EMD countries, some of these countries are not in such a good shape. So they should be definitely monitoring and looking, basically checking what's going on in their financial systems, making sure they don't end up with surprises. On the trade side, yes, I showed you some good news, but at the same time, there's still some non-tariff barriers to trade. For example, Indonesia has high non-tariff barriers, and lowering those could open new trade opportunities. At the same time, the services trade is restricted in the region. For example, here on the right, you see like where Japan is and where the OECD average, and Korea and Malaysia countries that have been successful in lowering restrictions to services trade and can benefit for those, especially with this increase in digitalization. But other countries like Thailand, Indonesia, Cambodia, China, now PDR, the restrictions are still high and they will benefit by lowering those restrictions. This is the last slide. At the same time, in some countries are still struggling with low productivity, and strengthening human capital and infrastructure would boost technology diffusion. An example comes from Malaysia, for example, that this low productivity measured by some estimates is basically can be traced back to managers finding the skills of the workforce not as adequate to compete in this changing environment where you have increased digitalization and open competition with the rest of the world. And for example, when we look at this map, which shows access to broadband, so basically it's broadband speed, internet speed. Like, if you want to benefit from digitalization and be part of it and use that, to implement new productivity improving processes, you can rely on slow internet speed. And then here we see that, with some exceptions, the speed of broadband internet remains slow in many countries in the region. So this was the end of my presentation. I basically recommend everybody to go check our website, look at the report there that they have. We even put this time a presentation of the report in 10 charts, so you can go quickly, don't have to spend a lot of time. All the materials related to the report, including the data for all the charts, is there. You can download and use it for your other presentations, or if you're teaching for any of your classes. And other video-related materials are there. So, and as always, feel free to reach out if you have questions.
Thank you very much, Egis, for your presentation. We feel always a privilege to become the first country to host the external presentation of the EAP regional update after it's being launched formally at the corporate level. Let me ask one question before reading the question that we received from our audience. You talked about the 4 policy areas, physical, monetary, trade, and human capital infrastructure, which is pretty much related to also digital diffusion. Now, last one, the 4th one, the human capital infrastructure, digital, seems apparently to have a lot with the private sector, even from the government perspective. So would you please talk a little bit about how the latest report see the private sector development in the region?
Thank you for the question, Koichi, and that's a very good question and a very tough one. So it's true, we come across this sometimes that, for example, I mean, let's not talk about infrastructure, but let's talk about education. When or spending on education for the region, right? So we try to basically bring some data and bring some analytical content to these updates. And one of the things that we're noticing is that they look, the spending on education in the region or human capital more broadly is low, right? Or also is social protection. And there were some people that have said, oh, wait, but if you also add, the private spending for education, then, the figure does not look as low. So I would say, I basically draw a parallel and say you can also say for infrastructure, yeah, maybe the governments are not investing that much, but because the private sector is innovating and doing this and that, then these things will come. So the first thing is basically that comparing across regions or looking at where they are compared to OECD countries, these spendings are really low for countries that you have estimates, for example, both for the private and for the public spending in infrastructure. And this historical data, the spending is not that high, and it can be made. It can increase. Second, we know that especially when it comes to things like infrastructure, the government can basically cooperate with the private sector and work jointly to increase those investments even further. I think I showed one chart here that was showing that both public and private investment was declining in the region, so that's a problem. Now, whether the government increases that by spending directly itself on infrastructure or by PPIs cooperating with the private sector, no, that's a separate issue. Now, the third, and we thought as the World Bank is the most important thing, is the distributional issues that this type of spending bring. Right. So let's say that the East Asia has the lowest spending on education, public spending on education, but has the highest spending on education in the world. What would that lead to, right? So maybe, if you look at the total level, you think, okay, things are fine, but you can see that there will be huge distributional problems there. Only the people that can afford will invest on that and improve their human capital, whereas the people who cannot afford it, who are poor, the less wealthy, to start with, they will remain so, and there will not be much upward mobility. So even in those cases, we see basically a role for the government to play. And the same thing can be made about infrastructure. So if the government does not level the playing field, but by ensuring, maybe broadband access for the private sector or other type of infrastructure that may need in this digital economy, only the top firm, the bigger firms will be able to benefit from that, and the smaller firms will remain small without access to technology.
Thank you very much for your responses. Let me read a question that we received from our viewers. Question from Mori-san. Thank you for your question as always. I'm worried about the vulnerable people in the region, particularly in smaller countries and islands, who may become even more vulnerable, excluded from the society, particularly the impact from the Ukraine situation continue. Would you please mention how the report sees this aspect?
Not good. I think it's a very good question, and I think there were two slides in the report that I went quickly because I noticed I spent too much time at the beginning, and basically these new developments that we are seeing, these new shocks, come on top of 2 years of recurrent COVID waves, which in some countries they responded by shutdowns, which hurt demand and in some cases supply directly, and in some cases they basically the private response was lower demand. And we know that a lot of households, especially the poor ones, they suffer the most because they had to sell assets to basically weather this shock. I think we showed this in the last update. Here I brought in the chart about food insecurity. So because the poorest are always the most food insecure, and now that they will get this new shock, we estimate that, for example, in the Philippines, just by looking at what happened now, the purchasing power of the households has declined, by something like 5% already. So if this continues, more and more people will have a problem. Now, what can the governments do about it? What we saw during this last crisis and during this last decade was that governments got pretty comfortable with expansionary policies. And this applies both to fiscal and monetary policies, especially in the last update, and some emerging markets, and this is not limited to East Asia, also started getting more creative with basically asset purchases and some non-conventional policies. Now, we should basically look back, and I think the report tries to look at that, but I don't think it does justice to look back at how this shock is different and how the policies should be different. One of them is that countries now are being faced with a lot of inflationary pressures. So even if they don't have inflation already, the pressures are there. In the last update, we showed that their inflation expectations are well anchored. But if these inflationary pressures continue, by well anchored, we meant that basically if there is like an increase in external inputs, in inputs costs in imports, for example, that are used as raw materials to produce other products, and while they think that these costs will be temporary, and while they see that their central bank is there to fight inflation, then people believe and investors believe that that those prices of imports will not be transmitted to consumer prices, and that's what we've seen so far. But it's not guaranteed that that will continue like that. So kind of should be, this is basically a supply shock that can last at least for some time. Would an expansionary monetary policy work? Probably not. So as of right now in the report, we argue that because there's still some space, countries should continue their expansionary monetary policies. But as time goes on, fiscal policy will be what matters and will be able to help those countries more. And they're better targeting and committing to future reforms to how to raise revenue, because that's a problem for our region, for the regional low revenue, are going to be crucial.
Thank you for your responses, Elgis. A question from Hirose-san. Thank you for your question. What are the key challenges in the transport sector in the region? How does the World Bank tackle with such challenges?
Well, so in this report, we only basically looked at generally, public investment, general public investment infrastructure, and we focused a lot more on issues with digital infrastructure investment. Right now, of course, the question seems more general than the report, and I guess we have an infrastructure global practice that deals with these issues, and they work directly with the countries to figure out, to make sure that in some cases this would be the private arm of the World Bank group. They will figure out what financing, how they can help with financing, and in many other cases they want the countries to continue their good investment policies, and the World Bank in some cases under certain conditions is able to help them bridge the financing gaps that may appear in their budgets due to covering the necessities. So this is being faithful to the question. When it comes to the report, again, our focus has been to the digital infrastructure investment, and we think more needs to be done.
Thank you very much for your responses. We received a question from Professor Yoshino during the presentation, so let me read his question. To develop digitalization in Asian region, digital infrastructure has to be constructed in various parts of the country. Huge investment would be required. Would private investors be able to come into digital infrastructure investment in Asia region? So this is a question from Professor Yoshino. Elgis, please.
Well, thank Professor Yoshino for the question. And again, it's a very broad and deep question. It relates a little bit with your first question, that we hope, and ideally we want the private sector to be there, not only to share burden, to share the costs. For example, in some kind, Thailand was doing that with PPP, but also we want them to basically be part of these developments, and they think through them, they think through what's needed, and that's the only way for the adaptation of these technologies in the region to happen quicker. But it's a little bit my personal opinion rather than an official stance, because we don't really delve into this that much in the report. It's probably to leave it all to the private sector. It's a little risky as well. So ideally, we would want the government involved. So opportunities are given to everybody. Case of companies, also to small firms, who otherwise will be left behind.
Thank you very much. Egis, you responded to the all the questions that we received from the viewers. Before wrapping up our session, any final words, final remarks from you?
Thank you, Koichi. It's always a pleasure to come and talk here. We were hoping that this update would have been lighter, in the sense that it was less about bad news and more about the recovery and opportunities. Unfortunately, that is not the case. We see these shocks that I described not just as risks or probabilities of things happening. These are things that have been happening. And basically in the report, and in our conversations, we've been encouraging all the countries to look carefully at what is happening, to have at least the goal of this report is to basically work together with our country economies to have a good assessment of what's happening in the region. And then when it comes to policies, as the World Bank and together with other institutions will think it through and find out what's the best outcome. But again, we're hopeful that this region is resilient and it will be able to weather these shocks as well, and that's why the report is called Braving the Storms. It's not a question mark, it's a statement.
Thank you very much. Great, thank you. We had a pleasure of having Elgis Islamaj, Senior Economist in the Office of Chief Economist for East Asia and the Pacific of the World Bank, who is the lead author of the latest edition of the East Asia and Pacific Economic Update. Thank you, Elgis, for your time to join us this morning. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you, Koichi.
Great, thank you very much. We have another online morning seminar this week. We will be featuring Aparna Somanathan, the practice manager for health, nutrition, and population of the East Asia and the Pacific. She will discuss the health, nutrition, population programs by the World Bank in the region, East Asia and the Pacific. So this will start at 8 a.m. on Thursday, April 14th in Japan Standard Time. So please check the details on our website. With that, I'd like to thank you very much for watching the seminar. Stay safe, stay healthy. See you on Thursday. Thank you.